Part 1. Have you ever found yourself sitting in the kitchen, staring at your hands, those same hands that once tied shoelaces, wiped tears, stirred soup, and wondered, when did they stop asking for your help? I think many of us reach a point where we begin to feel like the background characters in our own story, not out of bitterness, not even out of sadness, but a kind of soft fading, like an old photograph losing color. Our children grow up, our roles shift, and somewhere along the way, we start to wonder if being needed was the only way we ever felt truly alive. I remember a quiet Tuesday afternoon not long after I turned 70. The rain tapped lightly on the windows, and I had just finished folding some towels, my grandson's. Actually, he had stayed over the night before. He's 15 now, still sweet, still funny, but always on that phone. Anyway, I had just folded that last towel when I sat down and let out one of those long, breathy sighs that seem to come from deeper than your lungs. And I thought, is this it now? Not in a dramatic way, just wondering, reflecting. Because my mind, thank God, still felt sharp. But my body, it was starting to whisper things. My knees, mostly, and my balance, which used to be so solid, suddenly felt like it had a little question mark at the end of it. And that scared me more than I cared to admit. It was around that time I realized I had a choice. I could slowly shrink into this phase of life, resign myself to aches and memory slips, or I could lean in, not to fight aging, no, but to respect it, to partner with it. Even that journey began with something deceptively simple. Breakfast. For most of my life, breakfast was a piece of toast and a quick coffee. But I started reading, asking questions, listening to other seniors who were still lively and clear-headed. And one word kept coming up: berries, blueberries, raspberries, even blackberries when I could get them fresh. I started adding a small handful to my morning yogurt. Not much, just enough to bring some color into the bowl. The change wasn't immediate, but it was profound. After a couple of weeks, I realized my mid-morning fog, the kind that makes you forget what room you walked into, had started to lift. It was like a little bell ringing inside my brain again. There's something about honoring your body with food that actually makes you feel more present in your body. Not like you're trying to be young again, but like you're saying, hey, I'm still here. I still deserve care. The second shift came not from food, but from something even smaller, a walk. Now, I've never been what you'd call athletic. I was always the one who drove the kids to soccer, not the one playing it. But I began to notice something. On days when I stayed indoors, even when I had plenty to do, I felt more forgetful. My words got stuck on the tip of my tongue, and my patience, it thinned. So I tried something old-fashioned. I put on my soft sneakers, the ones I usually only wore to the mailbox, and I walked. Not far. Just around the block at first. It wasn't a power walk. It was a listen to the birds kind of walk, a nod to your neighbor walk. But here's the funny thing. Within a few days, my balance felt more stable. My knees ached less, not because they were younger, but because they were moving. And my thoughts, they felt clearer, more organized. It's as if my brain had been waiting for the rhythm of my steps to find its own rhythm again. And I noticed something else. Too, on those walks, I started to feel less invisible. People smiled. A young woman even complimented my scarf one morning. It was red, silk, and I hadn't worn it in years. Funny, isn't it? How small things can make you feel visible again. That's when I began paying attention to the kind of visibility that mattered most. Not the kind where you're trying to prove you're still useful, but the kind where you feel aware of yourself, where you treat your own body and mind with the dignity that maybe others forget to offer you. There was one morning, I remember it so clearly. I was walking past the park, and I saw a woman sitting on a bench. She had silver hair, beautifully tied back, and a Tupperware container full of almonds in her lap. She looked up and smiled at me, and I couldn't help but ask, "Is that your breakfast?" She laughed and said, "It's my brain food. My doctor said I should be eating a handful every day. So here I am, feeding my brain in public." That moment stayed with me, because she wasn't hiding, she wasn't embarrassed. She was nurturing herself, unashamedly, and there was something deeply powerful in that. That night, I bought almonds, raw ones. I don't eat them every single day, but they've become a little ritual, a way of saying, I value what happens inside this head of mine. And not just for others' sake, but for my own. I wish I could say all of this brought immediate change to the way my children looked at me, but that's not how this works. What did change, though, was how I looked at myself, the food I chose, the air I breathed in on those walks, the small, nourishing decisions I made. Those became little declarations of independence, not loud ones, just quiet, steady ones. And maybe, just maybe, that's where it all begins again. Not by waiting for others to give us permission to feel whole, but by reminding ourselves we already are. There's something no one really tells you about growing older. It's not just the physical changes that catch you off guard. It's the slow realization that, somewhere along the way, you started apologizing for taking up space. You begin softening your voice, offering less opinion, hesitating before asking for help because you don't want to be a bother. That feeling of becoming too much, or perhaps not enough, it doesn't arrive all at once. It creeps in, through the little moments, like when your daughter tells you she's too busy to chat, and you say, of course, sweetheart, I understand, even though your heart just needed 5 minutes of warmth. Or when your son comes over and scrolls through his phone half the visit, and you sit there smiling politely, pretending it doesn't hurt. It's easy, in these moments, to start questioning your worth, not loudly, not dramatically, but in quiet ways. You start rearranging your needs around others. You stop asking. You stop sharing. You become agreeable to avoid becoming invisible. I've done it too. For years, I thought my job was to keep the peace, to smile through the loneliness, to prove in every way I could that I wasn't a burden. But that kind of living, while noble on the outside, begins to chip away at the soul. You don't lose your sharpness overnight, but the edges soften, not in a wise, graceful way, in a way that feels like you're fading. That was the hardest part for my friend Margaret. She's 74 now, a retired librarian, soft-spoken, lovely spirit. She once told me, over tea, that after her husband passed and her son moved out of state, she began saying yes to everything, not because she wanted to, but because she was terrified of being alone, babysitting at odd hours, loaning money she didn't have, letting people talk over her. She said yes, hoping that yes would keep her relevant. But relevance earned through sacrifice isn't the same as being truly valued, and Margaret learned that the hard way. One day, she collapsed while climbing the stairs with 2 grocery bags, neither of which were even hers. Her knees gave out, and as she sat there on the steps, shaking from embarrassment and exhaustion, she realized something. If I disappear, she said, no one will notice until they need something again. That moment broke her open, not in bitterness, but in clarity. She started making changes, tiny ones. She began setting boundaries not with anger, but with grace. She stopped saying yes unless she meant it. She learned how to say no without apology, and something remarkable happened. Her posture changed. Her voice steadied. She still helped her son, still loved her neighbors, but she did it from a place of dignity, not desperation. And slowly, the people around her began to see her again, not just as someone useful, but as someone whole. It made me think a lot about how we carry ourselves, not just physically, but emotionally. I began paying attention to my habits. For instance, I used to clean compulsively when family was coming over, not because they expected it, but because I wanted to prove I still had it together. I'd exhaust myself scrubbing floors and baking pies, even when my knees begged me to rest. One day, after a particularly tiring visit, I asked myself, who am I trying to impress? They weren't even noticing the pie. That's when I discovered something surprising. Doing less doesn't make you less. So I started doing one thing each morning, not for anyone else, not to perform, but for myself. Some mornings it's Tai Chi, just 15 minutes in the living room with a gentle video I found online. It looks simple slow motions, graceful turns, but it does something remarkable inside. My breath slows down, my shoulders drop, my mind clears. Other mornings, I write. Nothing fancy, just a few thoughts in a notebook. sometimes memories, sometimes prayers, sometimes questions I don't know how to answer, but the act of writing makes me feel present, not for my children, not for my old job, but for me, and over time, these little rituals built something unexpected, inner steadiness. That steadiness began showing up in my conversations. 2, I noticed I was no longer trying to fill every silence. I didn't jump in to prove my relevance. I let my words carry weight, not because they were loud, but because they were thoughtful. My granddaughter, Emily, she's 22 and full of passion, once said during dinner, "Grandma, I like how you talk. You make people feel calm." That surprised me, not because it was kind, but because I hadn't realized how my stillness had become my strength. That's the thing, isn't it? We spend so many years proving our value by doing, but at this stage of life, it's the being that starts to matter most. And when we carry ourselves with quiet dignity, when we nourish our bodies, move gently, speak truthfully, the world begins to respond differently. Maybe not all at once, but it notices. I once read that self-respect isn't loud. It's not about winning arguments or demanding attention. It's the subtle energy that says, "I know who I am," even if you've forgotten for a while. And that energy, it starts with the way you treat yourself, the foods you choose, the walks you take, the space you allow yourself to take up in the world. There's a reason I eat leafy greens most days now. Not because they're trendy, not even because my doctor says so, but because I can feel my body say thank you after. There's a quiet clarity that comes from giving your brain and bones what they've been craving, simple nourishment, without guilt or restriction. And there's a kind of poetry in that, isn't there? We return to basics. We return to breath. We return to kindness, but this time, not just for others, for ourselves. It's a funny thing. The moment you stop trying to be seen is often the moment you become visible again, not because you changed who you are, but because you started living in alignment with who you've always been, beneath the pleasing, beneath the bending, beneath the years of soft-spoken sacrifice. It was around last spring when I began to truly feel that shift in myself. I had just turned 71. The mornings were getting warmer, and I'd found a little rhythm in my day's walks. Almonds, berries, greens, stretches, and space for silence. And I noticed something strange. My children started calling more, not with needs, just to talk. At first, I thought maybe it was coincidence. But over time, I sensed something deeper. The more I lived in my own steadiness, the more they began to lean in, not because I asked them to, but because the energy between us had shifted. That's when I remembered something my late husband used to say. He had this quiet strength about him, always calm, never one to raise his voice. One evening, after a particularly hard day with our teenage son, I asked him, "How do you always get him to listen without yelling?" He smiled and said, "Because I don't speak to control him. I speak from peace, and that kind of peace is hard to ignore." Back then, I didn't understand it fully, but now I do. When we stop living for validation and start living from alignment, something happens. We become less reactive, less afraid of silence, more sure-footed in our own presence. And that presence, it speaks volumes. Frank, my neighbor down the road, is 78 and still rides his bicycle every evening, not far, just to the lake and back. I once asked him what keeps him going, and he chuckled, "Balance. On the bike and off it." Then he paused and said something I'll never forget. Most people think independence means being alone, but real independence is needing less from people who drain you and more from the parts of yourself you forgot you had. That stayed with me, because the truth is, many of us weren't just seeking to stay healthy or sharp. We were seeking to remember ourselves, to reconnect with the parts of us that were never about service to others, but simply about being alive. That's what started happening to me when I picked up painting again. I hadn't touched a brush in decades. I used to love watercolors in my 20s, but life swept me up, children, work, meals, laundry, grief, duty. And then one day, walking through the community center, I saw a woman about my age, hunched over a small canvas. The way the light hit her face, it wasn't pride or performance. It was peace. total absorption. That night, I opened the bottom drawer of my dresser and found my old brushes. I don't paint well. I never did. But that's not the point. The point is, I lose track of time when I do it. I forget about the bills, the doctor's appointments, even the quiet house. I enter a space that belongs only to me. And the first time I showed one of my little paintings to my grandson, he said, "Whoa, Grandma, you made that." I nodded, and he said, "That's really cool." Not earth-shattering praise, but not indifference either. It was curiosity, interest, connection. And it made me realize something important. When we start doing things that light us up not to prove anything, not to fill anyone's expectations, we become magnetic. Not flashy, not loud, but real. People sense it, especially those we thought had forgotten how to see us. Even my daughter, who's always been the more reserved one, now asks me what I'm working on creatively. She never did before. And it's not because I suddenly became more interesting. It's because I started treating my own time, my own joys, as sacred, and she responded to that quiet reverence. That's how it works. You don't need to force people to respect you. You just need to begin respecting yourself again so deeply, so clearly, that others feel it when they enter the room. The same way I now feel it when I sit outside in the morning with my cup of warm water and lemon, a habit I picked up recently. Something about the simplicity of it resets me. It's not coffee. It's not productivity. It's presence. The ritual tells my body, you matter. You're here. And that quiet acknowledgement, it shapes the entire day. And yes, there are still hard days, moments where my joints ache or the house feels too quiet, or the phone stays silent longer than I'd like. But even in those moments, there's now a steadiness, a softness that isn't weakness but grace. Because I no longer measure my day by how much I gave away to others. I measure it by how rooted I felt in myself. Grace, my friend from the senior center, once told me something as we sat watching ducks float across a pond. She said, "You know, it's not that I don't want to help my kids anymore. I do. I always will. But now, I help from overflow, not depletion. Overflow, not depletion." That one line rewired something in me. Because for so long, I thought giving was the price of love. But now, I know that love given from a nourished place is more powerful than anything we force out of guilt or fear. I think that's why I now choose my foods, my activities, even my thoughts, with more intention. Not to stay young, but to stay connected, to stay whole. And I want to leave you with this. You don't need to be loud to be heard. You don't need to push to be valued. You only need to stand quietly, firmly in your light. And from that place, everything else begins to shift. If you've made it here, sitting with me through these quiet reflections, I want you to know something simple, but deeply true. You matter, not because of how much you do for others, not because you've earned approval, not because you kept the peace, or held back tears, or smiled when your heart ached. You matter because you're still here, still breathing, still evolving, still worthy of every ounce of gentleness and joy this life has to offer. Sometimes we need to hear that out loud, don't we? Especially when the world seems to rush forward without waiting for us to catch up. When our children, once the center of our days, now call less. When our hands, once busy with building and mending and holding, now tremble when we button a coat. When our minds, once sharp as winter air, take just a little longer to find the right word. But none of that takes away your brilliance. In fact, I believe aging is one of the most sacred things we can do, not because it's easy, but because it reveals, it strips away the noise. It teaches us what truly matters: presence, honesty, connection, peace. And if something in this conversation stirred something in you, a memory, a sigh, a little spark, I'd love to hear about it. Has your relationship with your children shifted over the years? Have you found quiet ways to care for yourself? Even when others don't seem to notice, leave a comment below if you feel comfortable. I read them. I truly do, not just out of curiosity, but because your stories have weight. They carry wisdom, and I believe the world needs more of that, more of you. And if this video made you feel seen, If even just for a few minutes, I'd be so honored if you'd stay connected with me. Click that little subscribe button, not because you owe me anything, but because I'd love for us to keep walking this road together. This space, this channel, it's not about being perfect or pretending the aches aren't real. It's about being honest and kind and strong in the quietest of ways. I believe with all my heart that this stage of life can be rich, not in the ways it used to be, but in new, slower, deeper ways. There is beauty here, and you are a part of it. So keep walking, keep nourishing yourself, keep making time for the things that light you up, whether that's a bowl of blueberries, a walk around the block, a painting you don't show anyone, or 5 minutes of stillness in the morning light. Because those little things, they're not small at all. They're the proof that you're still choosing you, and that is something sacred. Thank you for being here with me, truly. Until next time, take care of your heart, feed your mind gently, and remember, you don't need to chase love to be lovable. You already are. You always have been.